Welcome to Inspire Me with Jay, a podcast focusing on meditation, the near-death experience, and all things spiritual. Hello, this is Jay Spose with Inspire Me with Jay. My special guest today is Katherine Jansen Byrkit. How are you, Katherine?
I'm well, thank you, Jay. Thanks for having me on your show.
Well, I'm glad to have you. I was wondering, you talk about befriending yourself. How does someone befriend themselves?
Well, most of us have kind of a passive relationship to ourselves, so we don't think of ourselves as maybe a close friend, but often, sadly, we think of ourselves more as an enemy. When we think about how our self-talk is, we might be critical, we might be judgmental of ourselves. So befriending yourself is changing all of that towards a loving relationship. So you can start with your self-talk and just how you kind of, speak to yourself throughout the day. One can do kind things for oneself. I think you and I even talking about forgiving oneself. That is like a good friend. If we've made a mistake, then if we're sorry, we offer forgiveness. So it's all the kinds of things we would do in a really wonderful friendship is how we treat ourselves.
How do you forgive yourself and find peace with yourself? Sometimes when because I think we're the hardest critic on ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess if I do a lot of work with folks around having high standards, not perfectionistic standards for oneself in their life. So I'll just use myself as an example. If I am unconscious in any certain way, if I actively learn from what happened, I offer remorse to another person, I wave at the person that I accidentally cut off on the freeway. And the bottom line, Jay, is we get to be human because we are human. We're going to have missteps. And so once we kind of do the right thing with that misstep in terms of making, again, amends to another or learning from it or both, I would just offer that's the decision point is why not forgive ourselves? We can't change what already happened, but if we live in that self-criticism and judgment, it's super impactful in terms of our quality of life. And just even how distracted we are with beating ourselves up all the time.
Is it about letting go of judgments then?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we can, think of ourselves as young children. We learned judgment somewhere along the way. Children generally don't judge unless they are judged or taught judgment. And so we're really going back to maybe our original state of loving kindness when we think about practicing non-judgment towards self and others.
Well, I think the thing is too, is that people think if I don't judge myself, I'm not going to have any standards. I'm going to be sort of bottom of the barrel, but it's really the opposite, isn't it? When you let go of the judgments, you empower yourself to go forward and to be a better version of yourself.
Exactly. So that's such a good point because I often work with people that think judgment is the way to keep themselves accountable. And what I would say is we can be accountable in an environment of love just as much as, if not more, as in an environment of judgment. It's not about not being accountable. It's not about not having standards for sure. But why not do it from a self-loving place, which actually, again, is less distraction. People that are self-critical are also very self-involved. And because they're constantly in that thinking, those rabbit holes of I should have, could have, would have, why didn't I, shaming themselves. So it's one of the most wonderful things we can do for others, not just ourselves, to be accountable and, like you say, hold those standards without having to have judgment as a way to do so.
Have you ever wanted to learn to meditate? Check out my book, Meditation for Everyone: How to Quickly Have a More Peaceful, Mindful, and Fulfilled Life, and support this channel. With Meditation for Everyone, You will learn to quickly and easily meditate, relieve stress and anxiety, alleviate depression, and have more joy, peace, and relaxation. What you will learn, mindfulness, the art of stillness, step by step on how to meditate, strategies for overcoming challenges to meditation, and much more. D. Mason said this is a nice meditation book, even for those already meditating. I agree with the statements that it will help to have a more peaceful, mindful, and fulfilled life. 4.6-star rating, available on Amazon. Well, and is it sort of like when Jesus said, judge not lest ye be judged? Is it sort of that he's saying judgments really don't move people forward either? That you do more good by showing love and compassion generally than going into judgments on them.
Yes. Jesus and many other spiritual teachers as well. Yes, that path of compassion is the path of consciousness, the path of, ultimately love, which is one of our greatest, if not the greatest, spiritual ideal we can embody. Yeah, for sure. And what I find is that people often work on it from thinking, oh, Catherine, am going to work on not judging Jay. When really befriending ourselves, we realize that once I stop judging myself, my eyes actually soften toward other people. And I also don't think they're judging me when I don't judge myself. That's a projection that often happens too, is if I'm judging me, then I'm assuming other people are. And so I have that story ticking along all the time, which is often untrue. So it's a really, really important cornerstone to being wakeful and living our happiest, most conscious life is this non-judgment piece.
Is this connected to finding the spiritual path? Because you talk about, how do I get on a spiritual path?
Mm-hmm. Well, I work with a lot of people that aren't traditionally religious, but they really feel a connection to something outside of themselves or can relate to that idea, whether it's quantum physics or even serendipity in their life or listening to an inner voice. We might call that intuition, but some call that the God voice. It doesn't, in a way, really matter what the words are. It's just helping people open to finding something outside of just their human existence. And that can be very meaningful when you think it's just about whether you're religious or not. And if I don't identify as religious, then I'm not spiritual. And they're different. And religions are wonderful for many, many people. Obviously, there are no words to what it does to help people and guide people and offer solace. But some aren't on a religious path. So I wrote in my book a little bit about just cultivating your own spiritual path if you don't resonate with one that exists.
Do you sort of connect to something higher than yourself, whether you call it God or source or something of that nature?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And in my book, I think I say the word God once, but again, I just wanted to open this up to lots of different folks, anybody that could pick up a book about just an idea of living more consciously. Is that, like you said, Jay, they're self at best. And that is what I glean from all of the spiritual teachers and sages, is to be awake to not the ego self, but a self that's really interconnected to life and others and all beings and the source that created us. So yeah, I think, for many people, another piece we talking about today is purpose and meaning of life. And, our world is a tough place to live in. And if that's all you've got is kind of how good the Netflix show is, or whether or not you have enough money in the bank, and certainly, it's helpful to be stable, but it's that greater purpose and meaning is for many, many people about connecting to their own spirituality.
Was it part of that religion gives you a vehicle to practice spirituality? Because you have certain things you can do, like you got prayer, meditation, sacred scriptures of some sort, and it sort of gives people a way to crystallize it and practice it. Is there a way that you teach people to live spiritually that sort of incorporates some of those things? Like, do you have prayer and meditation or inspirational
Well,
things to read?
yeah, for sure. Well, I again throw a wide net spiritually, so I'm not identified personally nor professionally as Christian or Buddhist or Hindu or Jewish, but that in all of the teachings there are such powerful things. So people, I just encourage people to make those explorations. I think the big piece about connecting with it is not just for the personal experience of it, but in the collective. So where people worship together, where you are in a shared experience spiritually, that also has a real seat at the table. It's one thing just to have it be an isolated individual path, but if one can find community around their spiritual values, that can, especially these days when people after a pandemic and such have been pretty isolated, that could go quite a distance in terms of providing, depth and meaning to life.
So is there avenues for community? I mean, because I think when you think of organized religion, maybe it's for some people too organized. If you could have something more relaxed, but that we could do as a community, a lot of people might gravitate towards that.
Exactly. So for some people, they might even go to a yoga class. And of course, it's about their physical health at some level, but yoga is also about body practice, and some it comes from spiritual tradition, very, very deeply infused with spirituality. And they're in that class and they're having a shared experience with others. They're connecting to the divine within themselves. And that's their community, that's their church. Others, many others that I work with, it's in nature. They go hang out in the redwoods and they are deeply experiencing something beyond themselves in a very, very felt way. And so whether we take a friend in that community of the trees, yes, I think it's important to just be creative and kind of exploratory, if you will.
Mm-hmm. But it might be something that even if a person is religious, they might want to look at other things that they might do. Like if you go to church, you might still go to a yoga class or something and find meaning and
Oh,
purpose in that.
Exactly. And hopefully you start to see a lot of the resonance between, rather than differences. There's more sameness in the major religions and the deepest of the teachings. So I kind of liken it to just whatever, if you're Western culture, maybe Christianity really suits you. But if you're somewhere else, or even in this culture, there are other possibilities. Yeah. Are you a spiritual person yourself? Do you identify as?
I'm a Christian, and so I'm spiritual and I've got religious too. And I kind of find it interesting to look at other religions to see what they teach and to understand them better. Like I've watched several videos on Islam, and I've watched videos on Buddhism, things like that, just to understand the perspective where they're coming from. And I've always liked kind of the comparative religion classes.
I love that. I love that. One of the things that one of my favorite teachings of Jesus, and I was raised Presbyterian, so I had a very friendly, wonderful experience growing up in not just a Christian household, because we did a lot of other things. My mom brought a lot of other teachings in, but we did go to church regularly. And but anyway, the kingdom of heaven is within. And so one powerful idea is that God isn't out there somewhere separate from us. The God is us and lives within us, and we are and moving through us. And that non-dualistic approach to spirituality is very, very different from some of us that thought about it in very simple and traditional ways. God's out there, God's a male, separate from me. And so that's a premise by which I teach, and I wrote my book. And again, do not find that to be misaligned with the teachings of Jesus. So that exploration that you're doing, Jay, is wonderful to hear.
And I don't know if you've looked at it very extensively, but a lot of this podcast talks about like the near-death experience, which is sort of friendly to religions and sees the value in them, but kind of sees like maybe a larger reality to God or source than just confining it to a specific religion.
Exactly. Well, or in that case, for some, of course, with the more Eastern traditions in terms of reincarnation, even one human life. So that near-death experience, a piece that I have in the book, a chapter, is embracing death and dying. And there's a premise of psychotherapy that people don't even know it, but a lot of their deepest suffering and distress is that they have not contended with their mortality. And so even though that was kind of a clinical approach in terms of working with death and dying, I believe it's ultimately spiritual in our freedom to really not wait until we get a diagnosis to sort that out, but to understand our mortality and to kind of face death and dying and see what we find. And so many people, in fact, one story in my book in that chapter is a man who is soon to die. And he writes about, in facing his death and becoming unafraid of it, how incredibly freeing it was. And that was 3 years ago. And it's interesting, he stopped his cancer treatments, and not because he was trying to make some big statement, it was too hard on his body. And I told him recently, I'm gonna have to kick you out of my book if you don't die, because you're in the book of embracing death and dying. But his story is so about just not living in fear of death.
Mm-hmm. How do you find meaning and purpose in life? How does it connect to the topic of finding a spiritual path?
Well, like I say, I think our world is amazing, and I don't frame it as separate. I don't compartmentalize, there's the world and then there's spirituality, but it's a tough world to live in. And if we don't have that perspective that, wow, there are sometimes, and right this very day, horrific things happening. If I don't have any other context, then I'm just glad it's not happening in my country. I'm glad that's not happening in my household. It is a way to actually understand that there is unconsciousness and then consciousness, which is a form of talking about God, that meets all of that. It's not to bypass it. I don't know if you're aware of the term spiritual bypass, where people kind of avoid the tough stuff and just kind of think about just the good stuff. And that is unwise, unnecessary, and unhealthy to do from an emotional health kind of perspective. But again, if you only have the tough stuff without, wow, how is this part of the greater good and my greater good?
It's sort of like escapism, like some people would talk about, you use religion or spirituality as a crutch because you can't deal with life. But it's not supposed to be like an escapism, like going and watching a movie might be for some people, but it's a matter of helping you to cope with life.
Exactly. Yeah. And there was a parable shared. I'm part of a New Thought community here in Oregon, and the minister yesterday had it was just this great story. It's a story of this horseman who lives in a village, and he's masterful at riding horses, and he falls off the horse and breaks his leg. And all the village folks come to him and say, "Oh, you're so unlucky. You're so unlucky." And the gentleman says, "We'll see." And then a war breaks out. And of course, all the able-bodied men had to go to war, but he couldn't because he'd broken his leg. And so the village people say, "Oh, you're so lucky." And he's like, "We'll see." And the parable ultimately is that in any given moment we've fallen off a horse, and it's hard to see how this is part of our greater good. But if we can hang in there and kind of trust this kind of flow of wakefulness, of source, of love moving through us and in our lives, you know, what is unlucky is one of the greatest things that could have ever happened to us, right? So I don't know where you feel in your life you fall off your horse and have to get, maybe it's in self-forgiveness. You know, maybe it's in just having tenacity and persistence, and maybe there's a hard relationship in your life, or maybe you struggle with a part of your health, you know, and just finding that kind of inner support, not just befriending ourselves, but feeling like there is truly a universe on our side that's with us, you know, that energy.
Well, I think like in terms of your past and forgiving yourself, it's sort of getting to the point where you see life as a growth process. So I may have done all these things, but it was part of the growing process, whether it was good or bad. It helps me get where I am today, and it's part of a learning process. So when you
That's
kind of
right.
see it
And
that
there's
way.
exactly. And I don't have the exact name of the book, but there's a recent book I was reading and kind of bringing into my practice. And I have a wakefulness group, a group of folks that have met actually now almost a decade, based on ideas of living consciously and that definition of spirituality. But this book says, you know, basically it's about embracing regret versus this idea in our culture of no regrets. That's actually impossible. And regret is one of those really healthy human emotions like guilt, that it's not supposed to take us down and then we just can't ever pick ourselves back up. It is supposed to serve as what you're saying, this kind of opportunity to have regret as a way to understand a place we're not being ourselves at best, learn from it, grow from it, and evolve. Basically, we won't evolve without guilt and regret. And guilt versus shame, and they're very different.
Well, do you view death as just basically going to another dimension? Kind of like we don't really die, our body dies. It's kind of like taking off a coat and then putting on a different coat. And do you kind of see death in that way? That death is almost an illusion?
You know, because I identify and have direct experience around being source that is beyond Katherine and the individual humanness, this is the form. Yes, I absolutely. I also believe that it's okay to have it be a mystery. I don't think in a way we can know till we're there. Maybe those with near-death experiences have a bit more of a window in. I haven't had really a near-death experience. I thought I was having one time, but I wasn't that physically endangered. I just fell off a rock at the beach. But I got scared. I mean, it was high up and I hit rocks and then hit the water. And immediately there was a sense of God with me. So it's kind of both, I would say. There's an unknowingness, which I think is the mystery. And then there's a strong sense that there is something that continues beyond this human body and life.
Yeah, it's kind of
How
interesting.
about you?
Oh, I haven't had a near-death experience myself, but I do sort of believe that our body dies, but we don't die. So it is just sort of passing into another dimension. It's still kind of hard when you lose a loved one, though, because you can't just readily see them anytime you want or hear from them. So death is still kind of difficult for us on this side when we lose a loved one.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And again, without having religion or spirituality be a bypass of like, oh, I'll disassociate from my sadness and just plan on seeing them another time. That's actually not emotionally honest. If we lose a loved one, we will not physically hug them ever again. We can perhaps feel them. I can. Those that have gone, I can feel their presence. But there is a loss, and it's really, really important. I would say even the sadness is a part of the loving. we're sad, and for some relationships, deeply sad when those relationships end because we've loved so deeply. So it's very, very important to kind of embrace the humanity of it. That's, again, a premise I have for my book is we are spiritual. We are living a spiritual life, but in a human existence and in human bodies.
Hmm. I think the thing about mystery is important too, because there was someone named Mellon Thomas Benedict who had a very profound near-death experience, but I did hear him say on a show one time that there is something good about having mystery, even though he's had a lot revealed to him. There's something really good and beautiful about having some kind of mystery left. Because for a lot of us that are interested in spiritual things, we have a tendency to study and read and listen to a lot of things, trying to get sort of the answer to everything. And we just may not ever get the answer to everything. And that's okay, though.
Well, not only that, but it is kind of the arrogance of the human ego too, and the kind of thing I sense all of what we're referencing is beyond words, beyond, in a way, human understanding, especially when we think about how our neurological system works under what's called a default mode network, and kind of for efficiency's sake stays in a very small zone, and that expanding to other dimensions is bigger and wonderful, but harder for the brain in a certain way. And so trying to do that more and more, so we're not living in a small zone, but allowing there to be a sense, I don't know all the answers, and I don't have to know all the answers. In Western culture, we so worship the idea of information and mastering things and understanding. And this is, it's just a real good thing to surrender to some of that mystery.
So do you?
Where are you located, by the way, Jay? Are you in Colorado?
No, I'm in Montana, Anaconda, Montana. It's
You're
near
Montana,
Butte.
got it.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that,
Mm.
yeah, it's a beautiful country out there.
Yeah, the weather has been pretty good lately. Not too hot.
Yeah. Do you find a sense of spirit in nature yourself?
Yeah, I do. And I, besides the near-death experience, I'm really big into meditation. So I focus a lot on natural things. Because sometimes,
Yeah,
even when you draw like in the metaphor, because you talk about like, if you talk about things like the fruits of the Holy Spirit, it uses fruit as a metaphor for things like love, joy, and
right,
peace, and different things like that. So sometimes I'll
right.
visualize a metaphor like a big tree, and this will represent peace or whatever. So I kind of connect nature and spiritual things in a metaphoric way a lot.
That's great. Great. Well, and for some of us, the really meditation in that deep silence, and that in a way is right there, presence, because we're present and we're not just in the workings of the mind or the seeking desire, and pleasure, is prayer. And one of the greatest things about nature is its quietness and the presence of life in these other forms in its quietness. So I love that you're a meditator. That's one of my kind of personal traditions too. I've done 10-day silent retreats and found actually pretty profound trauma healing through some of that, not just kind of communing with source. So good for you. Good for you.
Is this sort of like a key for you to be able to connect and become more spiritual, to connect with all the things you're talking about, is through a meditative practice?
Yeah, and I would even say, and I can describe it, we don't probably want to take the time necessarily to do it, but even mindfulness. And mindfulness is about being fully present in the moment, of course, with acceptance. I started doing this years back, and now almost all of my ongoing clients couldn't even imagine a session without it. So basically, we close our eyes, and again, they're there for psychotherapy, although many of them are spiritual people, and they have that lens about what is going on in my life from that perspective. But we'll start with, well, we basically want 3 aspects of being present using a mindfulness ritual. One is present in the body. So I just have people close their eyes and I close my eyes. We take some deep breaths together. And I encourage them not just to observe the breath, because then they stay in their head, but to feel their breath and feel their body and drop in. We so often live shoulders up in our heads, and really divinity is connected to our bodies. Our bodies are highly tuned instruments to what's going on and what we need. So there's just this getting present physically. And then I just invite people to be in the moment, letting the breath really anchor us in present time. Our mind can be in the past, in the future, solving a problem, making a plan. And people, you probably know this as a meditator, it's very hard to quiet the mind from being busy. It's like a kid jumping up and down on a couch. So teaching people to just for this moment, let your mind rest where there's no problem. And the last piece is how we started our podcast today. It's turning towards yourself. So it's about being present with ourselves. Their eyes are closed. And I just say, turn towards yourself in your inner world and just feel you being with you, not with an agenda, but with loving eyes, without judgment, with compassion. So by the time they open their eyes 5 minutes later or less, they're present in their body, they're grounded in present time, and they're tethered to themselves, Jay. And those 3 things pretty much hallmark mindfulness, spirituality, relationship to self, being in our bodies, whole bunch of things. Living in present time, which is a perspective of mindfulness.
And it's always good throughout the day to be as present as you can in a moment, because if you're less focused on the future or the past, there tends to be less stress within you.
Right. Well, and there's a kind of an adage, where's the problem without a problem story? Our minds, I believe, almost because we have so much time on our hands, we're not hunting and gathering anymore, where we just have to every day, work for our survival. Our mind is kind of looking, it's called negativity bias, it's looking for problems. And then it has something to do to solve them. I don't know if you've ever kind of gotten quiet and then watching the mind of like, oh, have you really thought through that relationship? But what about that future potential event, which is really just speculation, projection. So to get the mind to be quiet and the second chapter of my book is on freedom from the mind and helping people understand you are not beholden to your thoughts and that they're not all true, and that you can actually begin to redirect your mind as well as quiet it over time through meditation practice.
Mm-hmm. Do you use any visualization to sort of put you in a present state? Whether you're like visualizing a beautiful scene in nature or something like that.
I might. I'm super visual and I use metaphor in my practice all the time. So if somebody is like, I don't know, I'm really feeling stuck in this relationship, usually I'll get not like a vision, like all of a sudden I'm channeling something like they had a past lifetime together, that kind of thing. I just get kind of a metaphor. And I often get nature metaphors, and people really love metaphor because it makes it concrete. Like, oh, yeah, that's exactly how it can feel. So yes, the answer to your question is, I don't like sit around and think about it. It just pops in, but when it pops in, I share it.
What specifically do you do in your practice? Do you call yourself
personal practice or my professional practice?
Professional practice.
I'm in private practice, so I see people 3 days a week, but very full days. So I have a full-time practice, and I'm doing some Zoom just because of the pandemic. Even local people, sometimes that's easier if they have young children, but I'm back to seeing people also in person. So 3 days a week, I run that practice. I have had a tradition over the last 20 years of doing retreats, couples retreats, couples groups. We have our little wakefulness group once a month that we do. And so I do some teaching and group work.
So where can people purchase your book if they want to purchase your book?
Well, thank you for that. They can connect with me on my website, which is www.harborglowholistic.com. They can go to Amazon. The name of the book is River to Ocean, Living in the Flow of Wakefulness. And so through me, and I can arrange to have a book sent to them and give them an autographed copy, or through Amazon or Barnes and Noble as well, if they want to do it through the internet. Okay.
Okay, well, thanks for being on the show. Is there one last word you'd like to
Yeah.
leave our audience with before we close out?
I guess I would say choose love, and that love moves in all directions, and that to me is the ultimate point of God's source presence. And so that means choose love with others, but put yourself in the line. Put yourself in the line, and let yourself be the receiver, such that others in your life are actually feeling that generosity towards yourself will be a generosity towards them.
Well, thank you.